Hi, and welcome to the Red Team Draft Podcast. I'm your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined by the usual complement. We had some silliness last week where Josh and I talked about Space Jam 2. That silliness is over, and it's time to get back on track and talk about the draft. And the whole team is here, starting with none other than Mr. Josh Earl. Josh, follow him on Twitter at 2RedJEarl. Josh, what's up, man?
Not much, man. Just living life. How are you doing, my friend?
Just living the dream. I mean, it's almost Christmas, a week from Christmas. Holidays, taking some time off. I mean, it's just all good, man. It's all good. Next, we have the prodigy, Mr. Connor Harr. Follow him on Twitter at Harr. Connor, finals are over. Connor, how's life treating you during the winter break season?
It's good. I want to give a shout out to my hometown, Youngstown State Penguins, for beating Ohio State today with the 26.5-point spread counted.
All right. Covering the spread. That appeals to the inner gambler in me. That seems like a really high spread, 26 points. And last but not least, we have our executive producer, Mr. Eustacchio Raulli. Follow him on Twitter at EVR1022. Eustacchio, what's up, man?
Not too much. Doing good.
Cool. All right. So today we want to talk a little bit about the 2018 NBA draft class. We're going to do a little bit of feedback, but I think there's some important framing here. We can't make overarching decisions. We can't decide this player was good, this player was a bust. Those questions are far too broad to ask this early on. We've got about a 30-game sample size. And if we ask the right questions, I feel like we can get the right answers. We can actually glean something from this small sample size. But to me, it's a very it's very much about the question that you ask. And I think it is this question, and see if you guys agree with me. I think the question here is that why is a certain player getting minutes? If we see a player who is playing a lot in a rotation, or a player who's playing in a playoff team as a rookie, or, these number of different things that we have seen through this draft class, why is that player getting minutes? And I think that's a question that, while it doesn't answer the broad question of is this guy a bust or whatever, has some real merit. Josh, would you agree with that sort of generally in terms of tone, like that if we ask smaller questions, we might be able to parse out some valuable information from this small sample size?
Yeah, one of the ways to tackle larger, highly complex questions is to decompose the variables into smaller questions, which is exactly what you're doing. And to be honest, over the 8 years that I've taught students how to work in the basketball industry, the first thing I always tell them when it comes to scouting is the most important question you have to answer when you're scouting is, why would this player get minutes on your team or on that level of competition? If you don't know the answer to that question, then it doesn't matter how much work you've done in tracking all the stats or noting, elbow angles on shot mechanics and all that sort of stuff, because you didn't actually try to solve the problem that is, making a decision on a player. You have to know, why would they actually play for you, or at least on this level?
Which brings us to I think a question to sort of start things off before we jump into the individuals in this class. And I think there are some really interesting individuals. We'll touch on that. But I think that it begs the question of draft philosophy. And Josh, you just wrote a fantastic piece on this today for your site, Contextual Scouting. You wrote a piece on what you called Elevate. Can you give us a little bit of breakdown about what Elevate is? And then I want to talk to Connor and Eustacchio both about what their draft philosophy is.
Yeah. So first off, thank you for the kind words.
No problem.
Secondly, Elevate's kind of been my personal personnel decision-making philosophy since I was Connor's age. So I've kind of held it for like a mere millennia or so. Since Connor is super young, people, prodigy. And I always kind of had a problem between the two dominant ideologies in draft philosophy in the media and in league circles, which are best player available and fit. I think there are issues with both of those that often go unaddressed. And so the Elevate approach, in a lot of ways, is kind of an expansion on fit with a little touch of BPA mixed in there. While best player available asks the question, who's the best player available? And Fit kind of asks the question, what does our team need? Elevate asks the question, which option available to us is most likely to elevate the overall team's performance closest to our goals. So like BPA, it's about maximizing value, but it's not about maximizing individual value. It's about maximizing the team value. So like Fit, it's also kind of team focused. And with Elevate, it's very much centered on having a really strong, deep, rich understanding of what your team is, what your offensive and defensive systems are, who are your current core players, and what do they do well. Because if you don't know those things, I think it's really hard to build a really strong lineup on the NBA level, strictly adhering to something like BPA or Fit. And I think having a strong understanding of who your team is can help clarify a lot of the decision-making process around the draft.
All right, Connor, I want to throw it over to you. You kind of want to build on Elevate there. So take the floor.
So yeah, first of all, I just want to start off by saying that I am not a very big proponent of BPA at all. But going into the Elevate concept, to me, what I felt like Elevate was, and sort of Josh hit on it, was that you want to maximize your team's potential, but in also doing that, you want to maximize every player on the floor's potential. So by being able to do that, I'm not saying that every player has to score 20 points a game a night. I'm saying that every player has to fit into their role within the system and be able to maximize their role to the best of their potential. So when you do that, you can have multiple star players that play different levels, play different roles on the team, and some might not be as fancy or as entertaining or stat friendly in the box score, but they hold so much value. For example, like if we talk about somebody that's rim runner, like how do they open up the floor for the other players on your team? If the other 2 or 3 players on your team can't shoot, the paint's just going to be clogged for your rim runner. They're not, but if you do have these shooters around him, maybe he's so good as a rim runner that potential of him finishing at the rim is so high that you're at a point now where you have to commit to, if I want this guy to get a layup or if I want my elite shooter to get a 3-point shot. So in that area, Big might not get the ball. He might not score the point, but he's still creating that opportunity for the team, for your team, without even having the ball. So I think that with the whole concept of Elevate, I really loved it. And this is something that I'm probably going to use for a really long time, but it's just, to me, the idea of being able to maximize every player's potential on the floor is ultimately going to maximize your team's potential.
All right, Eustacchio, you have a little bit of a different take on the draft. Why don't you give us your take on it?
What I try to focus on when I'm deciding between players is I like to key on how much that player will impact the team's identity. Now, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, Trae Young, for example, is going to define the Atlanta Hawks identity for the foreseeable future. He's a player that controls the ball the vast majority of the time he's on the floor, and he everything is going to gravitate around him. On the other hand, you have a guy like Mikal Bridges that could fit within any team identity. He's just a seamless fit, and he has almost no impact on the team's identity on the offensive end of the floor. So you can work him into any system. Now, altering a team identity isn't inherently bad, but you have to count the costs. Is it going to be worthwhile to take somebody that's going to change or alter the current team identity? But you have to note at the same time that even a team that won 73 games found a way to alter their team identity in a beneficial way by signing Kevin Durant in the offseason. So there's always opportunities to make positive changes, but you have to be careful about counting the costs of, will this player impact the identity in a positive or negative way? Too often we see ball dominant players have that negative impact on a team because they just aren't really good enough to be that focal point at the NBA level. So that's what I try to key in on with my draft philosophy. How will this player impact a team's identity?
I think you guys have done a really good job covering the top end of the draft and talking about how you construct a team sort of from the base up. But one thing that I want to touch on before we get into the draft is how often we neglect the lower end of the draft. And I think that something that is neglected is you see teams a lot of times add a player that they need currently. And you miss out on a player who might be in the long run more beneficial to the organization. And I think that's stopped happening as much because we're doing away with the coach, general manager dual role, which I think is a horrible thing because those are two very separate jobs. But a good example of this is 2011. It's off the top of my head. I should have looked at this before I said it. But the Celtics had a 27th pick in the draft. Jimmy Butler's sitting there. Butler was a pretty solid player at Marquette. He also played the same position as Paul Pierce. The Celtics had a number of wings on the roster at the moment. They needed a big man, and they ended up drafting Juwan Johnson out of Purdue. Now, Juwan Johnson was bad, but that's not really the point. The point was that Jimmy Butler was a player who had higher upside at the time. But the Celtics filled a role for that particular moment in time as opposed to looking for that player who had upside. And now, certainly there are times where you draft a player or you sign a player like Gary Clark if you're the Houston Rockets or Svi Mikhailiuk if you're the Lakers. You're trying to fill a need. You need more floor spacers or you need more wing defenders. And there certainly is some merit to that. But I think far too often we get short-term blinders when it comes to picks like 20 through 40. And I think that it is very important to continue to consider who are we now versus who are we going to be in 2 years. And of course, Josh, you will point out ever so correctly that in this situation, it's very hard to know who you're going to be 2 years from now. But I think it is important to consider a player in their first season as a building block to what the team's going to be 2 years from now when that player's ready to contribute. And I think so. I think a lot of it is there's some short-term blindness when it comes to filling positions of need for teams at the back end of the draft. And everybody, you guys really touched really well on what teams do at the front of the draft and the different ways that they approach it. But I think as you get into the meat of the draft is where you sort of separate the good, intelligent teams from the bad teams, because good teams can take pick number 20 and turn it into something, pick number 28 and turn it into something. The Spurs have done it for nearly 2 decades, and they are an organization that we should hold in high regard and try to emulate. And so I think that hitting a number 1 pick is excellent, but hitting a number 20 pick is something really, really special organizations do. And I think that's something we need to, as we look at this draft, sort of look at more is how do we nail pick 20? How do we nail pick 27 and maximize the value of that spot as opposed to just focusing on teams improving on 1 through 5? Let's get into the draft. So we want to talk about the 2018 class, and we should start at the top. Let's start with DeAndre Ayton. Ayton is exactly what he thought. He's what we thought he was. He's big. He's graceful. He's knows how to use his body well. He doesn't have great defensive IQ. He's not a player who's in the right position a lot. So, Connor, jump in on this one and give me the rundown on DeAndre Ayton, why you feel like he gets minutes, why you feel like he does contribute, and then sort of on the flip side, what you feel like he's not doing or could do better to get more minutes.
So with me for Ayton, I think that his biggest value offensively right now is his pick and roll game with the Suns. That's by far his most efficient value via synergy. And it's also helping the other players on the team have efficient values as well that are working the ball screens with him, like Devin Booker, who's in the 88th percentile on synergy for passes to the roll man, and D'Anthony Melton, who's we've kind of seen him be able to work these ball screens with Ayton, and it's really opened up a new level of Melton's game. Being able to navigate these ball screens that we might have not seen before from him is something that we'd see at USC. But I think that Ayton, to me, his value is as a finisher right now. I think that a lot of his ball screen work is best done on high pick and rolls, where you could sort of take advantage of his mobility and his finishing ability to sort of finish at the rim on the move versus just finishing at the rim, where sometimes he tries to be a little bit more of a finesse finisher and not take advantage of his physical attributes and be sort of a power finisher at the rim. So I think that's how he's getting minutes right now offensively. I think that also Ayton sort of hurts his minutes, and it's not really hurting his minutes now, but I think as time wears on, we will see that it's looked upon as inefficient, where he does a lot of mid-post isolation, and a lot of his mid-post isolation just results in him taking a jab step for a 17-foot contested mid-range shot that, quite honestly, he doesn't hit very often. If he ends up developing that part of his game, that's great. But at the same time, really, how much is him hitting a 17-foot mid-range jump shot over a contest going to do to help the team? And that's where I think that really hurts sort of the flow of the Suns offense. While they don't have very many creators, I get that. They also don't need somebody that's going to take contested bad shots, even though he eventually could hit them. So, and then team, like we talked about, team defensive awareness, that's always been a problem since college. And I think that's something that it's going to take time to learn. And if he does learn, because me and Josh talked about this before, where being able to be in the right spot defensively in the NBA is very hard. And if you don't have that sort of instinct and awareness already, it's very hard to gain. And it's a process that takes a lot more time, even though he might have some more room for error because he has all these athletic attributes that could help him out. But still, it's going to take a long time to figure out how to react, when to react, and where he needs to be.
Yeah, just to build upon that, the minutes he's getting comes primarily because he's getting 51% of his shots within 3 feet of the basket, and he's converting them at a 75% rate. On top of it, he's a really strong rebounder so far. He's 17th in the league in offensive rebounds, 9th in defensive, and 12th in total rebounds so far. So he's definitely bringing value to the Suns, primarily offensively, but even defensively, that 9th ranking in defensive rebounds, sometimes rebounding gets kind of separated out from defense, but a defensive rebound is finishing that possession for your opponent's offense. So there is defensive value there. That said, like Connor said, the jump shot's not there yet, and when you factor in the frequency with which he's taking those mid-range jumpers, it's not ideal. And, that defensive awareness really is going to take time. And it doesn't help that he doesn't have a lot of good defenders on the perimeter that, make his decision-making less important.
Yeah, I think there's some clear issues with Ayton, but at the same time, I've really been impressed with his finishing so far. One of the best roll men in the league so far this year, and his cutting, his putbacks have been impressive as well. I do think it's important to note that despite the weaknesses, there's a real possibility that he ends up being one of the best or the best finisher in the league for the better part of a decade. And so it's something that you have to try to weight against the weaknesses, and is it worth it? But he's like Alex said, a lot of this is really what we expected from him this year.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that Ayton has surprised us in any measurable way. He's become a great finisher. He's got great length. I mean, all these things that we have said. And then on the flip side, the questions about his defensive awareness are big, and I think they're just going to get bigger. So he is what we thought he would. Excuse me. He is what he thought they would be. Whatever. But I can speak English sometimes. But I think the question sort of is, when you look at what the Suns wanted to do when they drafted DeAndre Ayton, if you have to put it in a word, and I'm going to make you put it in a word, what is DeAndre Ayton? Is he best player available? Is he fit? Is he elevate? Josh, go. You get one word.
To them, he's BPA.
One word. You get one word.
I will not say that he's BPA, but they think he's BPA. So I spit in the face of your one-word answer.
All right. Connor, you get one word. Best player available. Fit. Elevate. What do the Suns view DeAndre Ayton as?
BPA. Suns fit.
All right. Okay. Eustacchio.
Dollars.
All right. He went to Arizona. He's putting butts in seats. I get it. See, one word. You see the economy of one word, Josh? He's giving him a round of applause. You see the economy of just using one word? He conveyed such a complex thought. That brings us to number 2 in the draft, and that's Marvin Bagley. Josh, give us the Marvin Bagley breakdown.
So the minutes he is getting are somewhat similar to Ayton in the sense, like, he's been a really strong finisher within 3 feet of the rim. He's actually completed a slightly higher percentage of his shots within 3 feet than Ayton. And he's also kind of flashed just some flashes of some spacing ability. He's only taking about 1 3-point attempt per game, but he's shooting around league average near that 35% range, which is very promising. The reason why he's not getting more minutes right now is also kind of like Ayton, team defensive awareness issues, but also I think just kind of fit within the Kings team. In theory, he works really well with Fox, but Bagley doesn't really protect the rim much or deter shots at the rim. And like I said, he's shown flashes of spacing, but he's best as a finishing threat. And if you play him with Bjelica, then you have no rim protection and not exactly great rebounding. So I think for him, the less minutes issue has been more tied to his fit within the Kings than it necessarily is to him and his skill sets per se.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of what Josh said is very correct. I think that Bagley is a guy that we've always labeled from the draft starting that he needs a very specific fit, and particularly on the defensive end, where you're going to need a rim protector that can also space the floor, because Bagley may not be able to he might be best utilized as a play finisher, as I should say. But I think that one of the things that needs to be taken into account in Bagley is that maybe this is a move that was being made to sort of set up future moves. I think that you could see the layout of where the Kings are going with their team, of having an attacking point guard like Fox and shooters like Hield and Bogdanovich. And maybe they're looking at sort of a solution here where they're trying to target Bagley as a 4 and try to get a stretch big, or maybe they're trying to target Bagley as a 5. And it's a very specific fit, and I think it's one that can be extremely hard to do, but something that can be very doable at the same time.
I had Marvin Bagley ranked second in this draft, and I still kind of stand by that. I think Marvin Bagley has tremendous upside. He has a really high motor, and he can do a lot using his body and his length on the defensive end that's not necessarily unleashed all the time. But I really liked him. And now if I had to sort of reflect on that, probably I was a little bit too low on Jaren Jackson Jr. seeing what I've seen sort of in hindsight, but I still stand by that Bagley is a tremendous player. I think one of the issues is that he gets compared directly to Bielitsa a lot. And I don't think that's really fair because that's not who Marvin Bagley is within the confines of the Kings. He's not a 1-2-1 Bielitsa replacement. He's a 1-2-1 Willie Cauley-Stein replacement. And Willie Cauley-Stein has not been tremendously effective as a rim protector this season either. And I think there's a little bit of a misconception that he's a really paint protecting center. That's something I see a little bit more often than I'd like to. Willie Cauley-Stein is not a tremendous defender. He doesn't really change shots. He's not a great defender. I mean, he's not a great rebounder. And I think that Marvin Bagley sort of slots into that role more naturally. And whether that continues to be true or not remains to be seen. The Kings don't really have a high draft pick this year. They owe it to someone, either the Celtics or the Sixers, but they do have a lot of cap money. They've got about $58 million this summer. So I think we'll begin to understand who the Kings view Marvin Bagley as long-term as they start to see the players get slotted in around him. And I think until then, we kind of just have to go with what we see, which is this player who doesn't have tremendous length to be a rim protector who's got pretty decent anticipation instincts for jumping pass lanes, but is out of position a lot. And those three things are, I mean, that's what rookies are. So I'm not overly worried about it. But like you said, when we were talking about Ayton, Connor, I think you said this, like, learning defensive instincts is incredibly hard. And Bagley has a little bit of a more advanced game than Ayton does, but he's definitely shown some IQ lapses. And that's a little bit worrisome to me. So I think we're going to learn a lot more about Marvin Bagley in years 2 and 3, not necessarily through his play, but through who they decide to put around him as they continue to build out this roster. Now, that brings us on to number 3, and these players, I think these top 3 are sort of inextricably tied to one another. At number 3, the Atlanta Hawks drafted Luka Doncic, and then, of course, they traded him down for pick number 5 and Trae Young. But Eustacchio, give us a breakdown on Luka Doncic.
So Luka's obviously had a phenomenal rookie year so far. I think his transition to the NBA as a scorer has been better than a lot of people expected. His jump shooting in particular has been excellent. 36% on three-pointers, which isn't a fantastic number in and of itself, but it's high volume and moreover a high volume of difficult shots that he's taking and making at a solid rate. And he's been good from mid-range as well, about 40%. And he's making an impact in just about every facet of the game. And so we knew that he was going to be a fantastic offensive prospect, but I think the scoring has developed more quickly than some of us anticipated pre-draft. He's averaging not quite 20 points a game, but it's pretty close. And so he's starting to run away with the rookie of the year a little bit. At the same time, I do think there are some causes for concern with what we've seen from Doncic so far. One of the things that some were worried about before the draft was, would he be able to get all the way to the rim? And to be fair, he can get close to the rim consistently at the NBA. We've seen him do a lot of good work driving towards the basket. He has an excellent floater game. He shoots 49% from the 3 to 10 feet range, which is really good for a player that's not a big man. But he is taking a lot of shots in that range. A league average player takes about 1.8 times as many shots at the rim as they do from the 3 to 10 foot range. However, Doncic is taking just 0.8 times as many shots from the 0 to 3 foot range as the 3 to 10 foot range. That ratio is concerning, to say the least, because he's not getting all the way to the rim. And so that's something that we can keep an eye on moving forward. Will he be able to fix that as time goes on, or is that going to be a persistent issue that may cap his efficiency inside the arc? And his passing, it's been quite good, to be honest, but you see that he needs to adjust his risk assessment for the NBA. It's a lot faster than Europe, and he has 57 bad pass turnovers so far. But, aggressive mistakes are good mistakes. Those are things that filter out as time goes on. And so I think we'll see the assists go up and the turnovers go down over the next few years. But it's just something that experience in the NBA is required to find the right balance in risk reward passing.
Yeah, Luka's been pretty much as advertised, with better shooting than a lot of people expected. And he's getting minutes because this kid's special. And, you know, there are some drawbacks and obviously some things he can fix, as Eustacchio mentioned. But I agree with Eustacchio. He's kind of running away with Rookie of the Year so far.
Yeah, I'm all in on that too. I think that he's got a strong case for Rookie of the Year. I think his pull-up shooting, like Eustachio mentioned, has been phenomenal, and I think probably a little bit above what we thought it would be, even though I think most people thought that it would be very good. Overall, though, I think that I've seen a lot of Doncic, and particularly without Dennis Smith. And I'm curious to see how he fits in with Dennis Smith, because I know that the Mavericks do run a lot of spread pick and roll, which is fine, but I'm not particularly a fan of Luca always consistently being that spread pick and roll handler. I think one of the things that made him so special in Madrid when we watched him scouting him was just how naturally he could put up 20 in the flow of an offense, and just how smart he was offensively and his ability to do that and do it in a lesser creation role before like half of Madrid's team got hurt and he was like all they had left. But other than that, I think that his, and Josh pointed this out, I should say, his, how Smith fits in with him and how he can work to help him should be one of the biggest questions that I want to see going forward, as far as seeing how the Mavericks are able to maximize two of their core pieces together, players they view as core pieces.
I think that it's possible that Lucas sort of rendered Dennis Smith Jr. Obsolete in terms of like team building. But I do think that's an interesting question, because you don't want to waste that asset. And a lot like Bagley, I think we're going to see a really interesting period with the Mavericks where they have to build a team around Luka Doncic, but they also have this player who has tremendous upside in Dennis Smith Jr. He's a monster athlete. He's a good rebounder for his size. He's all of these things. And I think that we will start to understand how the Mavericks view him as they start to put pieces around them. And Mavericks are a little bit weird because they never really dipped too far deep into the lottery, and they still landed a player who I view as really one of the generational talents that we've had in the past 10 years. So I think it'll be interesting to see how they sort of construct their new roster, and if Dennis Smith Jr. fits into that. He also may not fit into that. And I think that's something that warrants consideration, even though, you know, it's sunk cost fallacy. Like, he may just not fit in with Luka. And if that's the case, then you got to figure out what you're going to do with him. But let's go on and talk about Jaren Jackson. Jackson has been another impressive rookie. This class has really jumped out to me in terms of how well they contribute. Josh, give us the breakdown on Jaren Jackson, why he's getting minutes for the Memphis Grizzlies.
So, much like Ayton and Bagley, we mentioned that they're a very strong finisher so far. Jaren Jackson Jr. is actually a better finisher around the rim than they are so far. He's finishing 77% of his looks within 3 feet of the basket. On top of it, and this is what's particularly impressive, especially given what Connor and I were talking about before we started the pod, he's been a really strong individual and team defender fairly right away as a pretty young rookie, which is generally pretty rare in NBA history. I'm not trying to inflate this guy, but even really, really good defenders over their NBA careers weren't necessarily good defensively as rookies. So his big draw for getting minutes so far has mostly been his defense and the finishing aspect on offense, but he's also flashed some shooting and some ability to kind of attack off the dribble in certain situations. So that's why he's been getting minutes. And the primary reason why he's not getting more minutes is he leads the NBA in most fouls at 111 so far. He's about five and a half-ish personal fouls per 36 minutes. So if he can curb the fouls a little bit, then we'll see him get more minutes, I think.
I think one of the interesting parts about Jaren Jackson is that he's a player who's 6'10", 6'11", however tall he is, and the Grizzlies have shown a proclivity for running curls for him to shoot three-pointers off of. And to me, that's just amazing for a guy who plays center, who defends the paint so well, to have plays where somebody runs a pin down and he runs a little curl action and catches and curls into a three-pointer is unbelievable. Now, to me, the concern with Jaren Jackson is still legitimate. The one that we consider pre-draft and is that Jaren Jackson is not a tremendous rebounder. He's rebounding pretty well right now, but I'm not sure without a Marc Gasol, you're going to be able to play Jaren Jackson as your only big. You're going to need to find somebody else who is a really good or run gang rebounding, maybe with a whole group of people. Javon Carter's a decent rebounder. That's another building block for their future. But I think, twos and threes and fours who can rebound. If you're going to have Luka, you need to have guys who are all above average. If you're going to have Jaren Jackson, not Luka, you need to surround him with guys who are all above average rebounders. So I think there's still legitimate concern. I'm all in on the parade for Jaren Jackson. He's been spectacular, but I do think that his concerns and as you build a team around him, as you look into the future, are still pretty warranted.
Yeah. So where I'm at with Jaren Jackson Jr. is I really like his offensive fit within the Memphis Grizzlies, and particularly where you can have a guy, and this will further develop in the future once you start shooting more consistently, but you have a guy that is a shooting threat a little bit as a spot up shooter does a lot of work spotting up, but that ability to have that 6'10" guy that can open up the floor for guys like Kyle Anderson and Michael Conley and Marc Gasol, who are a lot more like change of pace sort of guys that need that sort of spacing to be able to work their way into the lane, helps them a lot. And then I think also Jaren Jackson being able to attack off of a closeout spotting up is a super, super valuable trait for them, where he can use his long strides and his athletic ability and his quickness and leaping ability to finish at the rim and above the rim on 1 to 2 strides, attacking a closeout. And I think that's very valuable within their offense. As far as his defense goes, I think that we really hit on just how special Jaren Jackson is in terms of awareness, but also he is extremely switchable. I said and prep for this when I was watching some of his tape against the Golden State Warriors, how many big guys are going to be able to switch on to KD, guard a Draymond pick and roll effectively, and be able to chase Steph off of 2 different screens on defense and be able to contest both his shots and force misses. At 6'10", 6'11", almost 7 feet basically, I think that his value defensively switching is also something that needs to be talked about for how well he does.
Let's move on and talk about number 5 and then get into some quick hitters. Let's talk about Trae Young, because Trae Young is probably the most divisive player in this draft. He's a guy who has been very hit or miss. People seem to love him or they seem to hate him. But Eustacchio, why is Trae Young getting minutes? Excuse me, I was thrown to the wrong person. Connor, you're the man who's getting this thrown to him. Connor, why is Trae Young getting minutes? What can he do to improve the amount of minutes he's getting in a game?
The reason Trae Young's getting minutes right now for the Atlanta Hawks is because he's their primary handler. He's their primary decision maker. Quite honestly, he's one of the few guys on the team that can create his own shot off the ball without any kind of movement or action necessary or not off the ball, I'm sorry, on the ball, without any kind of movement or action necessary. And he kind of constructs this offense and is the building block that the Hawks want him to be in the future. Even though there have been questions about him, the Hawks lead the league in turnovers, and Trae Young is a big part of why they are leading the league in turnovers. I think the reason this is why he isn't getting minutes is that his his decision making has not been particularly great to start the season, which is something that we saw at Oklahoma, where his turnover numbers were kind of high. And I think that the other reason why he isn't getting minutes is just flat out because of the defensive fit. Trae Young was always going to be a problem defensively. We always knew that. I mean, he gets killed and pummeled every single game on ball screens and dribble handoffs, and still really struggles to play through contact, especially on the defensive end of the floor. And ultimately, I think that Trae Young being so unplayable defensively with other components of the roster on the Hawks that get decent minutes kind of hurts their overall defensive value and outcome in the future. Since I've been watching a lot of the Hawks, I'm just going to go on sort of a tangent here where specifically talking about Trae's fit defensively is the 1-5 pick and roll that is really just completely unswitchable and extremely hard to guard between him and Dwayne Dedman. I think that as the NBA continues to grow, we want everybody to be switchable, and being switchable 2 to 4 and only having 3 players that can switch, and some of them not switch effectively as they should, is a lot less valuable than being able to switch 1 through 5 or even 2 through 5. So I think that there's some questions to be asked from Trae Young there. But speaking on to some of their other rookies, like Kevin Herter, I think is a great fit with the Hawks. I think he fits exactly what they want to do, and he's able to do it in such a low usage. It's amazing. I mean, he moves very well without the ball. His low usage passes and his ability to make decisions so quickly off the ball are phenomenal. And I think that he is going to be he was an elevate pick for them, where they have a guy that they're building around like John Collins, who to me is by far their best player on the court, and it's really not even close. And I think that his ability as a rim runner, like I talked about giving the specific example further back, opens up a lot of things for Kevin Herter and opens up a lot of shot opportunities for Kevin Herter, and could eventually open up a lot of shot opportunities for Trae Young as well. So I think that was a huge part in their offense. And Herter's also pretty good defensively. He doesn't get a lot of credit for how smart he is and can handle his own on ball. He's not really stand out, but he's definitely a guy that adds a little bit of team value. And then talking about going back to the Trae Young and Dwayne Dedman situation, where they took Amari Spellman later in that draft, and I think Spellman is another guy that we could potentially see elevate the ceiling of the Atlanta Hawks as a team, where Spellman can play Dwayne Dedman's role, who has a lot of value as a screener, being able to create open opportunities for guys like Herter, but his value as a screener can still be used in Spellman's value as well. But one of the things that would even open up John Collins, the ability to maximize John Collins even more, is having that stretch 5. And that's something that you're hoping Spellman can do in the future. He already has pretty strong shooting numbers that give you some promise, but you're hoping he can develop it more to where he could be that stretch 5 for them, where they can completely run an open offense and have John Collins sort of be the attacking guy in the middle, even without having the ball. And then lastly, Spellman's fit defensively, where he kind of showed a little bit more switchability than he got credit for at Villanova, probably because of his physical appearance. But he's a lot more nimble on his feet than he gets credit for, and he's a pretty quick reactor on ball. And I think that ability to be able to uplift the Hawks from being a 2 to 4 switching team to 2 to 5 switching team, because you're never going to be able to switch Trae Young anywhere, gives them so much more value defensively and makes them so much better as a defensive team.
Yeah, I just want to throw my 2 cents in here on the Hawks draft as a whole. Honestly, I didn't love any of their picks individually, but when you look at it as a whole, the vision is clear. They wanted to really emphasize spacing at the one, on the wing, and from their big men, and pairing all that shooting with John Collins. It makes a lot of sense. They had a clear vision. They executed it. And it seems to be working well so far. I mean, they're not a good team yet, but the pieces are in place, and over time, I think it's going to develop well. And in particular, I wanted to touch on Herder because he's someone that he surprised me. I didn't really rank him very highly pre-draft, which is odd because I'm usually drawn to 3-and-D types, but just something about him didn't quite convince me that he would have enough to be successful at the NBA level. And yet, clearly, right off the bat in this season, he's shown that he is an NBA player. He's shooting, I believe, 41% from deep, and he's making a well-rounded impact. So I think I learned something from scouting him, and I underrated him. And so it's helped me to make a few adjustments in how I examine prospects of that nature.
All right, we've covered the top 5. We're going to get into a little bit of a quick hits version, and we're going to talk about some players on down the list and why in particular they're getting minutes. Starting with number 9, the New York Knicks drafted Kevin Knox, who was a player that we were a little bit lower on at the 94 feet last year, and we have sort of sought to see why we were too low on Knox, or why the Knicks were too high on him, or what the situation was. But Eustacchio, why is Kevin Knox getting minutes this year?
Well, he's just a valuable archetype because, I mean, he's a switchable wing that shoots well from the perimeter, and he's athletic. And I think we maybe underrated just how valuable that foundation can be and how that can ease the transition to the NBA. It's pretty straightforward. He doesn't have an overly diverse game, but what he does, he's effective at. And he's an NBA player, and we ranked him at a range where that was questionable. So he's surprised me a little bit with how effective he is. And honestly, the Knicks drafted pretty well as a whole. They got Mitchell Robinson at number 36, who's done quite well. And then in undrafted free agency, they picked up Alonzo Trier. So they had a nice draft.
I think that Mitchell Robinson, I mean, since we're touching on the Knicks, we're doing this little team thing. I think that Mitchell Robinson has been a tremendous interior defender. He's 12th in the league in total blocks. He's 9th in blocks per game. He's shown himself to be a quality, serviceable player. I think what's interesting about him is we just did not see anything out of him last year. He was like a ghost. He didn't play at Western Kentucky, all the things that happened with that. It was incredibly difficult to place him anywhere. And I think finding him at 36 was incredible value. I think had we seen him, he probably would have been a much higher pick in the draft because that defensive archetype of a center is valuable. Now, he's not getting a tremendous amount of minutes because he fouls like 6.7 times per 36 minutes. And I think that if he can learn to improve his foul rate, contest straight up, he tends to contest outward instead of upward. And I think that that's been a real problem for him. So, I think that the Knicks did pretty well with what assets they had. I still don't love Knox at 9. And that's a player that's going to continue to plague me for some time. But let's go on and talk about number 10. Josh, you want to talk about Mikal Bridges for the Phoenix Suns or for the 76ers?
Both. So he was drafted by the Sixers and not with the intention of trading him later. That just kind of happened because the Suns blew them away with an offer. To me, Bridges was a clear elevate choice for the Sixers. Really kind of would have elevated what Embiid and Simmons were doing, would have really complimented those guys. And I think even if it's not quite an elevate pick for the Suns, I think he's a fantastic fit for them. His three-point shooting hasn't translated just yet, but he's one of those guys that's getting minutes primarily because he does a lot of the little stuff. He knows where to position himself defensively. He knows how to move off ball offensively to make sure that there's still a good passing lane or to help open up more driving space. So I think Mikal was a great pick for the Sixers, and then subsequently also for the Suns.
That brings us to Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at number 10. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander has been pretty impressive, a guy who maybe even looks like he was taken a little bit too low. He's a little bit exceeded his draft position. I think one of the big things that makes him so playable is his length. He can defend a lot bigger than he is. I mean, he's 6'6". He's a little bit too skinny for my taste for a guy as long and lanky as he is. I'd like to see him stay as quick as he is and add a little bit of bulk so he can defend a little bit better. But he's acquitted himself pretty nicely as a defender who can allow you to play some pretty flexible lineups. And I think that's something that can't be really understated, is that flexibility that he gives when you A, play lineups around him on a nightly basis, and B, try to build a team around him in the future. And I think that he is a really interesting player to watch because he wasn't a player who shot a lot of three-pointers. He was on that team in Kentucky with Knox. They didn't really have any floor spacers. He has evolved a little bit. He's shown a little bit more flash. He's knocking down 35% on his three-point shots. So I think that is something to watch. If he can develop that, he'll rapidly shoot up in terms of value for the Clippers. But I certainly think that even already he has showcased himself to be a very flexible and versatile player, which brings us to number 12, Miles Bridges for the Charlotte Hornets. Eustacchio?
Bridges was a player I was pretty high on, and I've been impressed with his transition to the NBA so far. There was some concern about him coming out because he was sort of this high usage, moderate efficiency type at Michigan State. He was their leading scorer, and question of how he would transition to the NBA. Well, what's happened so far this season is he's cut his usage in half. He's down to about a 15.5% usage player. And he's refined his shot selection as well. Just 9% of his field goal attempts are between 10 feet and the 3-point line. And he's finishing 77% of his shots inside 3 feet, 36% beyond the arc. So he's developed into this nice offensive role player, and he's making some pretty well-rounded contributions as well, impacting the board, solid assist to turnover ratio, and a little bit of defense as well. He needs work on that end still, but he's making some impact plays, and so he has had a good start to the year.
Yeah, I think that he's been pretty impressive with his bounce. I mean, obviously we've seen the highlight plays, but he brings a lot of versatility. He was a player I liked a lot more. I think you liked him a lot more too. I think 12 we felt was a little bit low, and it'll be interesting to follow his career and see what the Hornets end up doing with Kemba and how they end up integrating both Miles Bridges, and then of course their pick from last year, Malik Monk, who has never really found his feet, who he seems to be playing a little bit more this year, but has certainly had a hard time breaking into the rotation. So they have a lot of interesting pieces, and they have a lot of decisions they have to make. I think the next person that warrants talking about is Landry Shamet. He was taken number 26. He plays for Philadelphia now. And Connor, do you want to talk about Landry Shamet a little bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak on real quick. I think that when Josh talked about Bridges with the 76ers, he was kind of he was the elevate pick for the 76ers. I think that was very obvious. But Shamet, to me, is a really, really great fit. I'm not quite sure I would say that he's an elevate pick. To me, I think that they saw the clear need that they had, which was shooting off movement, which is something that Shamet has done very, very, very well. I mean, he's taken probably over half of his attempts have been 3-pointers. I mean, he's practically just tailor-made for that role that they want him to use, that the 76ers want to use him for. So I think that was a really good fit pick, and I think that also helps him a little bit defensively, where Shamet maybe was not as good as advertised in college, but he's still a pretty good defender, and at 6'5" gives you a little bit of positional versatility that's always helpful on the defensive end.
He's shooting 40% from three on 4 attempts a game. This is a player who converts on shots. I think one thing he needs to improve is he needs to distribute the ball a little bit better. At Wichita State, he handled the ball a lot higher usage, but he averaged 5.2 assists per game, and he was a player with some pretty decent vision on the film we watched on him last year. And I think to fit alongside Ben Simmons, you need a player who can initiate the offense and create for others to pair with him. That's why they've had success. I bang this drum on Twitter a lot. The most successful lineups that the Sixers have played include McConnell and Ben Simmons. And I think if Landry Shamet can find his way into that McConnell role, he's a more versatile defender. He's a much better spot-up shooter. And I think that if he can learn to distribute a little bit better, learn to initiate the offense, even though he is a shooting guard, I mean, I guess technically, then he will definitely keep his minutes in that rotation. I do think he'll probably end up losing it out when it comes playoff time, though. I'll be interested to see how that happens, but I just don't know that when they shorten the rotations, he's a guy who's going to get any minutes, even though I do feel like he's probably earned them. The next guy we want to talk about is Javon Carter, a player who has helped, I guess, continue the grit and grind Grizzlies. He hasn't played a tremendous amount, but in what he's done, he's been a menace. He was a menace against the Houston Rockets. Eustacchio, tell us a little bit about John Carter.
Well, he was such an impressive defender at West Virginia, winning the Defensive Player of the Year award and executing that full court press scheme for really an unprecedented amount of minutes for that team. And he's only played 2 games so far in the NBA, but you see that same defensive intensity coming out against Chris Paul, against James Harden, and really giving them a difficult time. These are multiple time NBA All-Stars. Harden's been an MVP, and he's making an impact against them on his first game in the NBA. And so I really like what he brings to that Memphis team. Along with Jaren Jackson, he gives them a good defensive foundation for the long term. But of course, this is a very small sample, so there's not much we can draw, not many conclusions we can draw from it yet. But it looks good on early returns.
Yeah, I think that Carter is going to be a bulldog, and I think he's helping keep that mentality, that grit and grind, that defensive blue collar mentality. I think that he's someone who's going to continue to find minutes in the rotation and probably at some point maybe take over for Mike Conley, maybe play alongside Mike Conley. That'll be fun to watch. What about the next pick in the draft, the Dallas Mavericks and Jalen Brunson, Eustacchio?
Brunson was a guy I stand for all season long last year, and there were some concerns that were valid about him heading into the draft, though. He was an older prospect, not the most amazing athlete, not very big or long. And so one of the big question marks was, would he be able to finish in the NBA? The assumption was against more athletic and longer interior defenders that his array of head fakes and pump fakes and all of that, all of those things that he got college players to bite on might not be so effective at the next level. And yet, what we've seen so far is that even though his jump shot and his free throws have been off the mark so far, he's finishing at an incredible rate for a player his size. 74% inside 3 feet, 56% from 3 to 10 feet. And so despite all those concerns, he's excelling at those very shots that we thought he might struggle with. And he was a high usage player or offensive hub at Villanova. At Dallas, he's more of a low usage guy that has a good balance between scoring and passing. His assist to turnover ratio is nearly 3 to 1. And so he's more of a role player at this level, but he's been very good at that role. And he's holding his own on defense. He's not good, but he's average to below average for the point guard position. And so honestly, I'm more optimistic about his long-term future than I was before the draft because the finishing has translated so well today. And honestly, there's enough evidence of the jump shot that I'm confident it'll come back despite the early struggles.
I don't want to take up like 24 hours with this podcast, but I do think that there's some legitimate concern about Brunson and his ability to guard quicker point guards. He kind of got eaten up the other night. I was watching the Kings and the Mavs, and Fox kind of ate him up quite a few times on cuts, on being able to just blow by him, putting him on his back hip, particularly on pick and roll moves. I think that something like that is a legitimate concern for Brunson, though I do think he fits better alongside Luka than Dennis Smith Jr. So there's a lot of give and take when you talk about Jalen Brunson and what he does. But there's one more player, and I got too excited talking about Landry Shamet, and I skipped over him, and that's Josh Okogie. Okogie has been playing for Memphis in the rotation. He's averaging 18 minutes a game, but he puts up about 2 or 3 defensive plays a week that you go, oh my God. So I think that Okogie is a player who has shown defensive versatility. He has shown an ability to guard bigger than he is, to switch, to help contain dribble penetration. And I think those things have made him tremendously valuable to that organization. I think as he goes forward, he's going to need to shoot a little bit better. He's only shooting about 30%. And he's missed some shots where I feel like shots that he should be knocking down. He was never a tremendous shooter at Georgia Tech. I mean, he was 38% low usage, on the shorter line. He wasn't a blow you away shooter, but he definitely has missed some shots at the NBA level that I feel like he would have made at the college level. So maybe if that starts to normalize, we'll see a larger contribution by Josh Okogie in terms of minutes. But I've been very impressed for a player who was taken 20th to come in and play on a team who I guess is a playoff team. I mean, I think we probably will end up being proven that they're not a playoff team, but they certainly were when Jimmy Butler was with them, and Okogie was even playing minutes with Butler. So I think that's one more player worth talking about. But guys, is there anything else that needs to be said on this class, or are we good on them?
I think we're good. The rest of the guys really need more minutes before we can really make any determinations about them, update our projections. But overall, it's been an impressive class. There's a lot of guys that are getting minutes and they're holding their own. And so I'm interested to see how they continue to develop over the rest of the season.
Shout out to my man Zan and Musa, killing it in the G League right now.
There you go. So, guys, before we go, anybody got anything they need to say? I mean, Connor jumped in, so you can follow Connor at Harr Connor on Twitter. He's hungry, so I'm not going to go back to him. He's trying to get this thing all wrapped up. But Josh, anything that you have to plug before we get out of here?
Just check out the aforementioned article on my site, Contextual Scouting, titled "Why We Should Strive to Elevate a New Player Personnel Decision-Making Approach." I kind of dig a little deeper into the pitfalls of both BPA and FIT and kind of elaborate more on what elevate means. So definitely take a look at that.
All right. Eustacchio, anything from you this week to look forward to?
I need to write more. Not really. But just follow me on Twitter. I'll post a few things on there. And we're working hard on our Red Team Scouting Draft Guide, which you can look forward to a little over a month. So we're working on that, but nothing to show yet.
Our excellent producing staff has called to my attention that I said Josh Okogie played for Memphis when, in fact, he plays for Minnesota. And I knew that. I think I just saw M-I-N, and I can't read, and so I said Memphis. So I do want to apologize to all Timberwolves fans out there. I do know where Okogie plays and what he plays, but apparently the brain to mouth, there was a disconnect. So anyway, I'm going to be writing a piece on the danger of hyperbole this week. It's going to be worth looking at in Hoop Think column. I think creating high points, anchor points that are too high is something that can damage a player when we look at him in a long-term outlook. So that's something I'm going to explore a little bit. Check that out. Should be out on Thursday morning. Other than that, guys, we're going to be rolling out those updates on the Red Team Scouting Draft Guide, which will be breaking sometime in late January. We haven't set a date yet, but as soon as we do, you'll be able to hear it here first. So for Eustacchio, for Josh, for Connor, for all of the guys at Red Team Scouting, we have added a bunch of them, and we can't wait to introduce you to all of them. So we'll see you guys in a couple of weeks. We have not decided. I think it's not going to be Christmas. It's not going to be New Year's. It's probably going to be the week after that, but we will keep you in the loop so you'll know where to look for us. Make sure to follow us at Red Team Scouting. For the Red Team Draft Podcast, I'm your host, Alex West, and we will see you later.